Welcome, dear listener, to this journey through the culinary shadows of Victorian London. As you settle in for a bit of history to relax or drift off to sleep to, I invite you to get cozy, let your mind unwind, and allow my words to paint a vivid picture of a very different time and place. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time of day it is for you. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know. And if you enjoy this kind of calm, immersive storytelling that blends history with soothing narration, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next bedtime history journey. Now let's set the stage, shall we? The year is 1858, and London is the bustling, beating heart of the most powerful empire on earth. The sun never sets on Queen Victoria's dominion, yet darkness lurks in the very shadows of her capital. Smoke belches from factory stacks, horses clop over cobblestones, hawkers cry their wares, and nearly 3 million souls call this labyrinth of streets and alleys home. But beneath London's facade of power and prosperity, all is not well. A noxious stew of poverty, disease, and adulterated food is quietly ravaging the populace, especially the poor. For you see, in this age before refrigeration, regular sanitation, and real regulation of the food supply, Londoners are playing a dangerous game of dietary Russian roulette with every bite. Over the next hour or so, we'll explore the seedy underbelly of Victorian London's food system in all its rancid, revolting glory. We'll meet the unsung heroes who fought to bring about change, and we'll marvel at the sheer resilience of a people who managed to survive these hungry years. So get settled in, perhaps with a cool glass of clean water or a warm cup of unadulterated tea, and let's embark on this journey together. Our story begins in the sweltering summer of 1858, a season that would go down in infamy as the year of the Great Stink. London, you see, was drowning in its own filth. With a population that had quadrupled in just 50 years, the city's primitive sewage system simply couldn't cope. Cesspools overflowed, human waste seeped into basements and streets, and the mighty River Thames itself had become little more than a giant open sewer. As the heatwave dragged on, the stench of London's accumulated excrement grew so overpowering that it even disrupted the business of government. The curtains of the Houses of Parliament were soaked in chloride of lime in a feeble attempt to block the reek wafting up from the Thames. One civil servant, in a fit of Victorian understatement, called the smell very unpleasant. But this was no mere assault on the nostrils. The Great Stink was a symptom of a far more insidious problem. You see, in a time before the link between germs and disease was understood, this fetid atmosphere was a breeding ground for all manner of contagion. Cholera, typhoid, and dysentery ran rampant, spread in no small part by a hopelessly contaminated food supply. The very staples upon which the Victorians relied, bread and beer, had become vectors for illness and deceit. Unscrupulous bakers, seeking to cut costs and disguise inferior ingredients, laced their loaves with alum, chalk, and even sawdust. The whiter the bread, the higher the status, so bakers used these adulterants to give even the cheapest flour a deceptively pure appearance. As for beer, the foamy pint that was the working man's faithful companion, it too fell victim to Victorian corner cutting. Cheap, often toxic ingredients like strychnine and Cocculus indicus were used to bitter and strengthen watered-down brews. The phrase, "one for the road," takes on a rather more ominous meaning in this context. But amidst this grim landscape, a few brave souls were beginning to question the status quo. One such hero was a humble doctor with a nose for trouble, a certain John Snow. No, not that John Snow. London's problems couldn't be solved with a Valyrian steel sword. Dr. Snow had a hunch that cholera, the scourge that had claimed tens of thousands of lives in London's slums, was being spread not by bad air, as was commonly believed, but by contaminated water. Through meticulous investigation, Snow traced a major outbreak in the Soho district to a single water pump on Broad Street. With grim satisfaction, he removed the pump's handle and watched the epidemic subside. Snow's work was a major step forward, but the battle was far from won. The Victorian poor, crammed into squalid rookeries where sewage seeped and clean water was scarce, continued to subsist on a diet that was as much a threat as it was a comfort. Perhaps no single food better embodied this threat than so-called swill milk. In a perversion of pastoral ideals, Victorian dairies kept emaciated cows in squalid city stables, feeding them the swill, or slop, left over from gin distilleries. This thin, bluish liquid that the cows produced was then doctored with anything from chalk to plaster of Paris to give it the illusion of richness. The human cost of this vile concoction was devastating, particularly for the innocent. Swill milk was linked to shockingly high infant mortality rates, as babies gulped down a bacterial cocktail with every sip. In some London workhouses, nearly 100% of infants fed on swill milk perished. A Victorian social reformer, the great Henry Mayhew, would later write of these tragic babes: "The child's life hangs upon a thread, and the slightest change in the quality of the milk or the mixtures with which it is adulterated is sufficient to snap that thread asunder." Mayhew was among the first to lift the veil on the swill milk trade. In a series of blistering newspaper exposés, he revealed the filthy conditions of London's urban dairies and the human misery they produced. His work sparked a wave of public outrage and added to the growing clamour for food reform. But the fight was far from over. In the fetid, gas-lit labyrinth of Victorian London, danger lurked in every bite and sip. Rotten meat, doctored with chemicals to appear fresh, filled butchers' windows. Sausages crafted from sawdust, diseased animals, and worse, became the dubious fuel of the working poor. And in the candy shops that enticed children with their bright colours and sweet scents, poison masqueraded as innocent pleasure. But I'm getting ahead of myself. These scandals, and the heroes who fought to end them, are tales for another stretch of our journey. For now, as you feel sleep beginning to tug at your consciousness, ponder for a moment the courage and resilience of the Victorians who endured these hungry times. They were the victims of a food system gone horribly wrong, but they were also the agents of its reformation. In our next chapter, we'll meet more of these unsung heroes, the chemists, the campaigners, the whistleblowers, who refused to stay silent in the face of adulteration and abuse. We'll explore the great Victorian food fights, from the swill milk scandal to the Bradford sweets poisoning, and we'll see how a nation slowly began to awaken to the importance of pure food and clean water. But those are stories for another night. For now, let the gentle embrace of sleep wrap around you, secure in the knowledge that your next meal is unlikely to contain sawdust or strychnine. And as you drift off, spare a thought for the Victorians who weren't so lucky, but who paved the way for the safer, more bountiful food system we enjoy today. Good night, dear listener, and sweet dreams. I'll be here waiting when you're ready to continue our tale. There are so many more scandals to savour, so many more heroes to cheer in this great, grimy drama of London's food history. Until then, sleep well, and know that no matter what challenges the future may bring, we can take solace in the hard-won victories of the past. As the squalid conditions in London bred disease and despair, the very food that was meant to nourish and sustain the people became yet another source of misery and suffering. The swill milk scandal was one such dark chapter in the city's history, a tale of greed and callous disregard for human life that left an indelible stain on the conscience of Victorian society. In the crowded, filthy streets of London, where space was at a premium and fresh grazing land a distant dream, Dairy cows were kept in cramped, poorly ventilated city stables. These emaciated creatures, a far cry from the healthy, contented animals that roamed the green pastures of the countryside, were fed a diet of swill, the putrid alcoholic dregs left over from the distilling process. The thin, bluish milk they produced, known as swill milk, was a pale imitation of the rich, creamy liquid that flowed from the udders of their country cousins. Yet this swill milk was all that many poor families could afford, and they bought it eagerly, unaware of the hidden dangers that lurked within. For the unscrupulous dairymen who peddled this tainted product, profit was the only concern. They watered down the milk to stretch their supply, and added chalk and other adulterants to disguise its poor quality. The result was a substance that was barely fit for human consumption, a thin, bluish liquid that provided little in the way of nourishment and carried with it the seeds of sickness and death. The tragic consequences of the swill milk trade were all too apparent in the high infant mortality rates that plagued London's poorest districts. Babies fed on this thin, contaminated milk often failed to thrive, their tiny bodies wasting away as they succumbed to diarrhea, malnutrition, and infectious diseases. For their desperate mothers, the sight of their sickly, listless infants was a source of unbearable grief and helplessness, a cruel reminder of the harsh realities of life in the slums. But amidst the darkness and despair, there were those who refused to turn a blind eye to the suffering of London's poor. One such figure was Henry Mayhew, a journalist and social reformer whose tireless efforts to expose the evils of the swill milk trade would earn him a place in the annals of history. Mayhew was a man of great courage and conviction, a crusader who believed that the pen was mightier than the sword in the fight against injustice. He spent long hours in the stinking, overcrowded streets of London, talking to the poor and the destitute, the street vendors and the costermongers, anyone who could give him a glimpse into the grim realities of life in the slums. And as he listened to their stories and witnessed their suffering firsthand, Mayhew's resolve only grew stronger. He knew that he had to do something to expose the truth about the swill milk trade, to shine a light on the unscrupulous dairymen who were putting profit before human life. So he set to work, pouring all his energy and passion into a damning newspaper expose that would shake Victorian society to its core. With meticulous attention to detail and a keen eye for the human stories behind the statistics, Mayhew painted a vivid and harrowing picture of the swill milk trade and its terrible toll on London's poor. He described the squalid city dairies, with their emaciated cows and putrid swill, and the thin bluish milk that flowed from their udders. He spoke of the desperate mothers who bought this tainted product, unaware of the hidden dangers that lurked within, and the sickly, listless infants who suffered the consequences. And he named names, pointing the finger at the unscrupulous dairymen who put profit before human life, the men who watered down the milk and added adulterants to disguise its poor quality, all the while turning a blind eye to the suffering they were causing. When Mayhew's expose hit the newsstands, it sent shockwaves through Victorian society. For the first time, the comfortable middle and upper classes were confronted with the grim realities of life in the slums. The human toll of the swill milk trade laid bare in all its horrifying detail. There was outrage and disgust, a growing chorus of voices demanding change. But there was also resistance from those who profited from the status quo, the powerful dairy lobby who fought tooth and nail to protect their interests. Yet Mayhew would not be silenced. He continued to write and speak out, using his platform to rally support for the cause of reform. And slowly but surely, his efforts began to bear fruit. In 1875, Parliament passed the Sale of Food and Drugs Act, which prohibited the adulteration of milk and other food products. It was a milestone moment in the fight for food safety, a recognition that the health and well-being of the people mattered more than the profits of a few unscrupulous traders. But the battle was far from over. It would take years of tireless campaigning and advocacy to truly transform the dairy industry and ensure that all Londoners had access to safe, wholesome milk. And even then, the spectre of the swill milk scandal would linger long in the memory, a haunting reminder of the dark underbelly of Victorian society. Yet as we look back on this chapter in London's history, we can also find inspiration in the courage and determination of men like Henry Mayhew, the crusaders who fought tirelessly to expose the truth and bring about change. Their legacy is a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there are always those who will stand up for what is right, who will fight for the health and dignity of their fellow human beings. And so we remember the swill milk scandal not just as a tale of greed and suffering, but also as a testament to the power of the human spirit, the indomitable will to make a difference in the face of adversity. It is a reminder that progress is possible, that even the most entrenched injustices can be overcome with perseverance and courage. As we continue our journey through the dark underbelly of Victorian London, we will encounter many more such stories of struggle and triumph, of ordinary people rising up to face extraordinary challenges. And through it all, we will be reminded of the enduring resilience of the human spirit, the unquenchable thirst for justice and dignity that has always been a part of our shared history. So let us pause for a moment to remember the victims of the swill milk scandal, the innocent lives lost to greed and callousness, and let us also pay tribute to the heroes who fought to bring about change, the men and women who refused to accept injustice as the natural order of things. Their legacy is a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope, always the possibility of a better tomorrow. And as we continue to fight for a world where everyone has access to safe, nutritious food, we can draw strength and inspiration from their example, secure in the knowledge that progress is possible, that a brighter future lies ahead. But the story of London's food woes is far from over. As the city grew and changed, new challenges and scandals would emerge, each one a testament to the ongoing struggle for justice and dignity in an often unforgiving world. One such scandal was the adulteration of tea, a staple of the British diet that had become increasingly popular among the working classes. For centuries, tea had been a luxury enjoyed only by the wealthy, a status symbol that set them apart from the common rabble. But as the British Empire expanded and trade routes opened up, tea became more widely available, and by the mid-19th century, it had become a beloved part of the national identity. But as demand for tea soared, so too did the temptation to cut corners and boost profits by any means necessary. Unscrupulous merchants began to adulterate their tea with a variety of cheap fillers, from sawdust and sheep dung to toxic dyes, and even iron filings. The result was a product that was often barely recognizable as tea, a bitter, unpalatable brew that bore little resemblance to the fragrant, comforting drink that had captured the hearts of the British people. For the poor, who relied on tea as a cheap source of comfort and sustenance, the consequences of this adulteration were dire. The toxic additives in their tea could cause a range of health problems, from stomach ulcers and kidney damage to more serious conditions like lead poisoning. And yet, with few other options available to them, they continued to drink the tainted tea, day after day, year after year. Enter Arthur Hill Hassall, a crusading chemist who made it his mission to expose the truth about tea adulteration and bring the perpetrators to justice. Born into a family of doctors, Hassall had a keen interest in public health and a deep commitment to using science to improve the lives of ordinary people. He began his crusade against tea adulteration in the early 1850s, using his skills as a chemist to analyze samples of tea from across London. What he found was shocking. Nearly half of all the tea sold in the city was adulterated in some way, often with substances that were harmful or even deadly to human health. Hassall's findings caused a sensation when they were published in the Lancet Medical Journal, sparking a wave of public outrage and calls for reform. But the tea industry, like the dairy lobby before it, was a powerful force, and they fought back hard against any attempts to regulate their business. Undeterred, Hassel pressed on, using his scientific expertise to develop new methods for detecting adulteration and working tirelessly to raise awareness of the issue among the public and the press. His efforts paid off in 1860, when Parliament passed the Food Adulteration Act, which prohibited the adulteration of food and drink with any substance that was injurious to health. It was a landmark moment in the fight for food safety, a recognition that the health and well-being of the people mattered more than the profits of a few unscrupulous traders. And yet, as with the swill milk scandal before it, the battle was far from over. In the years that followed, Hassel and other reformers would continue to fight against food adulteration, pushing for stronger regulations and harsher penalties for those who put profit before public health. They would face resistance and setbacks at every turn, but they would also inspire a new generation of activists and advocates, men and women who believed that everyone had the right to safe, wholesome food. As we remember the tea adulteration scandal and the work of Arthur Hill Hassel, we are reminded once again of the enduring power of science and activism to bring about positive change in the world. We are reminded that progress is possible, that even the most entrenched injustices can be overcome with perseverance and courage. And we are reminded too of the ongoing struggle for food justice and food sovereignty, the fight to ensure that everyone, regardless of their income or social status, has access to safe, nutritious, and culturally appropriate food. It is a fight that continues to this day in London and around the world as activists and advocates work tirelessly to build a more just and sustainable food system. But even as we grapple with the challenges of the present, we can draw strength and inspiration from the heroes of the past, the men and women who fought tirelessly to expose the truth and bring about change. Their legacy is a reminder that we all have a role to play in the fight for justice, that each of us has the power to make a difference in the world. So let us pause for a moment to remember the victims of the tea adulteration scandal, the innocent lives lost to greed and callousness. And let us also pay tribute to the heroes who fought to bring about change, the scientists and activists who refused to accept injustice as the natural order of things. Their example is a call to action, a reminder that we all have a responsibility to stand up for what is right, to fight for the health and dignity of our fellow human beings. And as we continue on our journey through the dark underbelly of Victorian London, let us carry their spirit with us, secure in the knowledge that progress is possible, that a brighter future lies ahead. But the fight for food safety in Victorian London was far from over. As the city grew and changed, new scandals emerged, each one a testament to the ongoing struggle for justice and dignity in an often unforgiving world. One of the most insidious of these scandals was the adulteration of candy, a practice that preyed on the innocent desires of children and left a trail of tragedy in its wake. In the mid-19th century, sugar was becoming more affordable and widely available, fueling a boom in the production of cheap sweets and confections. For many working-class families, a penny's worth of candy was a rare treat, a moment of sweetness in a life that was often harsh and unrelenting. But as demand for candy soared, so too did the temptation to cut corners and boost profits by any means necessary. Unscrupulous candy makers began to adulterate their products with a variety of cheap and often toxic fillers, from red lead and mercury to copper and arsenic. The bright colours and sweet flavours of these tainted treats belied the deadly substances lurking within. The consequences of this adulteration were devastating. Children who consumed these poisoned sweets often suffered from a range of horrific symptoms, from stomach pains and vomiting to seizures and paralysis. Some even died, their young lives cut tragically short by the greed and callousness of the candy makers. One of the most notorious cases of candy adulteration occurred in Bradford in 1858, when a batch of peppermint lozenges was found to be contaminated with arsenic. The lozenges, which had been purchased by a local shopkeeper from a travelling salesman, were sold to unsuspecting customers, many of them children. Within days, people began to fall ill, suffering from a range of terrifying symptoms. As the death toll mounted, panic began to spread through the town. Rumours swirled about the cause of the outbreak, with some speculating that it was the work of a vengeful ghost or a malevolent witch. But as the investigations continued, the truth began to emerge. The lozenges had been adulterated with a deadly dose of arsenic, likely as a result of shoddy manufacturing practices and a lack of regulation. In the end, 21 people died as a result of the Bradford sweets poisoning, most of them children. The tragedy sent shockwaves through Victorian society, sparking a wave of public outrage and calls for reform. But the candy industry, like the dairy and tea lobbies before it, was a powerful force, and they fought back hard against any attempts to regulate their business. It would take years of tireless campaigning and advocacy to bring about meaningful change in the candy industry. But the Bradford sweets poisoning remains a haunting reminder of the human cost of unchecked greed and the urgent need for stronger protections for consumers. As we remember the victims of the Bradford sweets poisoning and the countless other tragedies that befell the children of Victorian London, we are reminded once again of the ongoing fight for food safety and consumer protection. We are reminded that progress is hard-won, that it often comes at a great cost, but that it is always worth fighting for. And we are reminded too of the enduring power of activism and advocacy, the ability of ordinary people to come together and demand change in the face of even the most entrenched injustices. It is a lesson that resonates to this day, as activists and advocates around the world continue to fight for a safer, more just, and more sustainable food system. So let us pause for a moment to remember the children of Bradford and all the other innocent lives lost to the callousness and greed of the Victorian food industry. And let us also pay tribute to the heroes who fought to bring about change, the brave souls who refused to accept the status quo and who worked tirelessly to build a better world for future generations. Their legacy is a call to action, a reminder that we all have a role to play in the fight for justice and dignity. And as we continue on our journey through the dark underbelly of Victorian London, let us carry their spirit with us, secure in the knowledge that progress is possible, that a brighter future lies ahead. From the swill milk scandal to the Bradford sweets poisoning, the fight for food safety in Victorian London was a long and often tragic one, marked by countless setbacks and hard-won victories. But through it all, there were those who refused to give up, who believed that a better world was possible, and who worked tirelessly to bring about change. One of the most remarkable of these heroes was a group of young men who came to be known as the Poison Squad. Led by a chemist named Harvey Wiley, the Poison Squad was a group of volunteers who willingly subjected themselves to a series of grueling experiments in order to prove the dangers of chemical additives in food. For months on end, the men of the Poison Squad consumed a steady diet of foods laced with borax, formaldehyde, and other toxic substances. They suffered from a range of horrific symptoms, from stomach pains and vomiting to headaches and dizziness. Some even developed more serious conditions, like kidney damage and neurological disorders. But through it all, the men of the Poison Squad remained committed to their cause. They believed that their sacrifice was necessary in order to bring about meaningful change in the food industry, to force lawmakers and regulators to take action against the unscrupulous manufacturers who put profit before public health. And their efforts paid off. The work of the Poison Squad helped to galvanize public opinion against the use of chemical additives in food and paved the way for a series of landmark food safety laws, including the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. But the fight for food safety was far from over. In the decades that followed, new scandals and new battles would emerge as consumers and activists continued to push for stronger protections and greater transparency in the food industry. And yet through it all, the legacy of the Poison Squad and the other heroes of the Victorian food reform movement would end. As the fight for food safety gained momentum, one of the most daring and unconventional investigations was undertaken by a group that came to be known as the Poison Squad. This band of brave volunteers, led by the unflappable Dr. Harvey Wiley, willingly subjected themselves to a diet of questionable food additives in order to prove, once and for all, the dangers lurking in the Victorian food supply. Dr. Wiley, a chemist with the US Department of Agriculture, had long been suspicious of the various chemicals and colorings that were routinely added to processed foods, but he knew that to make a convincing case, he would need hard evidence of their harmful effects on the human body. And so, in 1902, he assembled a group of young, healthy men and set out to essentially poison them in the name of science. For 5 years, the Poison Squad ate meals laced with increasing doses of common food additives like borax, formaldehyde, and copper sulfate. They recorded in detail the often unpleasant physical symptoms that resulted from headaches and nausea to more serious digestive issues. Dr. Wiley himself joined in the experiment, believing that he could not, in good conscience, ask others to take risks he was unwilling to take himself. The findings of the Poison Squad study, published in 1907, made it undeniably clear that many of the chemicals used in food processing had no place in the human diet. Armed with this damning evidence, Wiley became a vocal advocate for stricter food safety regulations. His work was instrumental in the passage of the landmark Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 in the United States, which for the first time required food labels to list all ingredients and prohibited the use of any additives proven to be harmful. Wiley's crusade and the sacrifices of the Poison Squad reverberated across the Atlantic. In Britain, the public outcry over food adulteration reached a fever pitch in the early 20th century. Fueled by the tireless work of campaigners like Arthur Hassall and the revelations of the Poison Squad, Parliament finally took decisive action with the Food and Drugs Act of 1875. This sweeping piece of legislation prohibited the sale of food or drink containing any injurious ingredients and made it an offence to mix, colour, stain or powder any food item with ingredients meant to render it harmful to health. Crucially, it also established a system of public analysts to regularly test food samples for adulteration, adding a much-needed layer of oversight to the food industry. The impact of these reforms was gradual but profound. By the turn of the century, the worst of the food scandals that had plagued Victorian Britain were largely a thing of the past. Bread was no longer whitened with alum and chalk. Milk was no longer watered down with filthy puddle water, and candy was no longer coloured with deadly metallic compounds. For the first time, the purity of the food supply was a matter of both government and public concern. Of course, the fight for safe and wholesome food was far from over. Even today, with all our advanced food safety regulations and modern testing methods, issues of adulteration and contamination still crop up from time to time. But we owe a great debt to the brave activists, scientists, and whistleblowers of the Victorian era, who quite literally risked their own health to bring the dangers of the food supply to light. As we tuck into our meals each day, it's easy to forget just how much we take the safety and abundance of our modern food for granted. But spare a thought for the Victorians, who endured some of the darkest and hungriest years in British history. Their hard-won battles for pure food paved the way for the much safer, more varied and more delicious diets we enjoy today. So the next time you bite into a crisp apple or savour a sip of rich creamy milk, take a moment to remember the everyday courage of those who came before us. The men and women who fought tirelessly to ensure that the food on our plates is not just filling, but safe and nourishing too. Their legacy is nothing less than the foundation of our modern food system, and for that, we owe them a debt of gratitude that can never be fully repaid. As we come to the end of our journey through the harrowing food landscape of Victorian Britain, it's worth reflecting on just how far we've come. In the space of just a few generations, we've gone from a world where food was routinely doctored with poisons and stretched with fillers, to one where we can enjoy an unprecedented bounty of safe, varied and nutritious options. But let us never forget the hard lessons of history. The story of food adulteration in Victorian Britain is a cautionary tale, reminding us of what can happen when profit is put before public health, and when the drive for cheap, plentiful food trumps all other concerns. It's a reminder that the safety and purity of our food supply is not something we can ever take for granted, but something we must continually fight to protect. So as we drift off to sleep, our bellies full and our minds at ease, let us spare a thought for the unsung heroes of the Victorian food wars. The brave activists, the dogged scientists, the whistleblowers and the reformers who fought so hard to ensure that the food we eat is not just filling, but safe and wholesome too. Their legacy is the very foundation of our modern food system, and for that, we owe them a debt of gratitude that can never be fully repaid. Good night, and bon appétit. As the fight for food reform gained momentum, a group of brave volunteers emerged who were willing to put their own health on the line in the name of science and public safety. They became known as the Poison Squad. The Poison Squad was the brainchild of Dr. Harvey Wiley, the chief chemist at the US Department of Agriculture. Wiley had long been concerned about the increasing use of untested chemical additives and preservatives in food, but he needed hard evidence to convince lawmakers to take action. So in 1902, Wiley assembled a group of young, healthy men and set them up in a special kitchen in the basement of the Agriculture Department. There, they were fed meals laced with some of the most common chemical additives of the time, things like borax, formaldehyde, and salicylic acid. The men of the Poison Squad knew they were taking a risk. They signed waivers absolving the government of responsibility if they became sick or died. Each day, they would sit down to meals carefully prepared with measured doses of suspected toxins. Wiley started with small amounts, gradually increasing the doses as he studied the effects. And those effects soon became apparent. The men experienced digestive distress, headaches, and skin rashes. Some developed more serious symptoms like vomiting and diarrhea. A few had to drop out of the study altogether due to the severity of their reactions. Throughout it all, Wiley meticulously documented the squad's decline in health. He used this data to publish alarming reports and put pressure on Congress to act. The Poison Squad experiments went on for 5 years, capturing the public's attention and sparking outrage. While the US was a world away from London, the impact of Wiley's work was felt across the Atlantic. His findings added to the growing body of evidence that chemical additives posed a real danger to human health. It bolstered the arguments of British reformers pushing for tighter regulations. The tide was beginning to turn. In 1875, Parliament passed the Sale of Food and Drugs Act, which for the first time made it an offence to sell adulterated food or drinks. The Act defined adulteration and set penalties for violations. It was a major step forward, though its enforcement was still somewhat patchy in the early years. But the very fact that the Act existed at all was a testament to the work of campaigners and scientists on both sides of the Atlantic. Men like Arthur Hassel, Henry Mayhew, Thomas Wakeley, and Harvey Wiley had fought tirelessly to expose the dangerous practices of unscrupulous food producers. They had put their reputations, and in some cases their own health, on the line to force change. And slowly but surely, those changes began to take hold. With the passage of the Food and Drugs Act, local authorities were empowered to take samples and submit them for analysis. Adulteration didn't disappear overnight, but it did become a much riskier proposition for would-be food fraudsters. Public analysts were appointed in towns and cities across Britain. Their job was to regularly test samples of food and drink being sold to the public. If they found evidence of adulteration, the offending merchants could be fined or even jailed. Over time, this system of testing and enforcement began to clean up the food supply. The widespread adulteration and contamination that had plagued early Victorian London gradually became a thing of the past. By the dawn of the 20th century, Britons could have much greater confidence that their food was safe to eat. Of course, this progress didn't come without a cost. For decades, ordinary Londoners had endured what became known as the Hungry Years, a time when the very food they depended on to sustain life was slowly poisoning them. The effects of this tainted food had fallen particularly hard on the poor, who were forced to subsist on the cheapest and most adulterated products. But through it all, the people of London had shown a remarkable resilience. They had soldiered on through outbreaks of cholera and other diseases, through scandals and scares, never losing their quintessentially British keep calm and carry on spirit. And in the end, their perseverance paid off. Thanks to the efforts of reformers, scientists, and ordinary citizens who spoke out against abuses, the food supply was gradually cleaned up. The days of chalk in the bread and lead in the candy slowly faded into history. Looking back from our modern vantage point, it's easy to take our safe, abundant food supply for granted. We rarely stop to think about the hidden additives in our packaged snacks or the cleanliness of the dairies that produce our milk. But the Victorians didn't have that luxury. For them, every meal was a game of Russian roulette, a roll of the dice that could lead to sickness or even death. So perhaps we owe them a debt of gratitude, these ancestors of ours who endured so much. Their suffering paved the way for the food safety regulations we now take for granted. Their struggle ensured that we can sit down to our meals without fear of being poisoned. In the grand scheme of history, perhaps the travails of the Hungry Years were a necessary evil. They shone a light on the dark underbelly of the food industry and galvanized a movement for change. Without that catalyst, who knows how long the abuses might have continued unchecked. So the next time you bite into a sandwich or sip a glass of milk, take a moment to remember the Victorians. Remember the reformers and scientists who fought for change, and the ordinary people who endured so much in the name of progress. Their story may be a difficult one, but it's one that deserves to be told and remembered. And with that, we come to the end of our journey through the dark and twisted alleyways of Victorian London's food supply. It's been a harrowing tale at times, full of swindlers and poisoners, and no shortage of human suffering. But it's also a tale of progress, of the slow but steady march towards a safer, healthier world. So let us take that progress to heart. Let us never forget the lessons of the Hungry Years, or the courage of those who fought to end them. And let us always strive to do better, to create a world where safe, nourishing food is a right for all, not a privilege for a few. Thank you for joining me on this journey through history. May your dreams be sweet, and your meals always free from adulteration. Good night, and sleep well. As the swill milk scandal raged on, another scourge was lurking in the meat supply of Victorian London. The city's explosive growth had outpaced its infrastructure, and the lack of refrigeration and reliable transportation meant that much of the meat arrived in the city already spoiled. Desperate to sell their rotting product, butchers resorted to thoroughly unsavory practices. They would rub the surface of putrid meat with sulfites to remove the telltale smell and disguise the rot. Copper sulfate was used to give the meat a bright red color, simulating freshness. This toxic compound, disturbingly, is also known as blue vitriol. The Smithfield Meat Market, the largest in London, was a disturbing spectacle. Rivers of blood ran through its cobbled streets, attracting swarms of flies. Livestock was slaughtered on sight, their entrails and offal left to fester in the sun. The stench was overpowering, a miasma of decay that clung to the clothes of those who ventured too close. But perhaps no one embodied the ethos of the tainted meat trade more than Thomas Otter, the self-proclaimed sausage king. Otter ran a sprawling factory in the heart of London, churning out cheap sausages by the cartload. His secret: a stomach-turning blend of old meat, rancid fat, sawdust, and breadcrumbs, all minced together and stuffed into casings. Otter's sausages were enormously popular among the working poor, who couldn't afford better cuts of meat. They were sold from street carts and in public houses, often washed down with a pint of watery beer. For many Londoners, Otter's sausages were the only meat they could put on the table. But the truth about the Sausage King's empire was far darker. Otter was not above using diseased animals in his products. When supplies ran low, he would send out scouts to round up stray dogs and even cats, which would end up in the day's batch of sausages. Horsemeat too found its way into Otter's grinders, with shocking regularity. Despite persistent rumours about the contents of his sausages, Otter remained defiantly unrepentant. "Sawdust is cheap," he once quipped to a journalist, "and meat is dear." He even floated the idea of making sausages out of whale meat, arguing that there's many a poor man who has eaten whale without knowing it. Otter's luck finally ran out in 1862, when a disgruntled employee tipped off the authorities about the unspeakable conditions in his factory. Investigators were horrified to find piles of rotting meat, buzzing with flies, and vats of greasy slurry waiting to be stuffed into casings. Otter was hauled before the courts, where he was fined a paltry £50 and allowed to continue operating. The saga of the Sausage King laid bare the deficiencies in Victorian London's food supply. For the poor, adulterated and even outright toxic food was often the only option. The concept of food safety was still in its infancy, and unscrupulous operators like Otter exploited the lack of regulation to turn a tidy profit. But change was on the horizon. The shocking revelations about swill milk and tainted sausages had begun to stir public outrage. Reformers and activists were beginning to demand action, arguing that access to safe, wholesome food was a basic human right. Among them was a young chemist named Arthur Hill Hassall, who would become an unlikely hero in the fight against food adulteration. Hassall's specialty was microscopy, the study of minute objects through powerful lenses. He had a particular fascination with the microscopic world of food, and he began to systematically collect and analyze samples from across London. What he found was nothing short of horrifying. Tea, the beloved beverage of the British Empire, was routinely cut with leaves from other plants, sheep dung, and even toxic dyes. Coffee was mixed with chicory root, acorns, and burnt sugar. Bread, the staff of life, was whitened with alum and chalk, while rancid butter was coloured with poisonous lead chromate to make it appear fresh. Hassall published his findings in a series of articles for the Lancet Medical Journal, accompanied by detailed illustrations of the adulterants he had uncovered. The public was shocked and outraged. How could such widespread deception be allowed to continue? The answer, of course, was money. Adulterating food was enormously profitable, and the fines for getting caught were laughably small. Hassall estimated that the total value of adulterated food in Britain was as high as £15 million per year, an astronomical sum in Victorian times. But Hassall was determined to effect change. He began a relentless campaign of public education and lobbying, arguing that food adulteration was not only a threat to public health, but a moral outrage. His efforts caught the attention of Parliament, which launched a series of inquiries into the problem. In 1860, Parliament passed the first Food Adulteration Act, which prohibited the sale of adulterated food and drink. The act was a milestone in the history of consumer protection, but it was also deeply flawed. Enforcement was left up to local authorities, who often lacked the resources or the will to prosecute offenders. Hassall continued his crusade, publishing a book called Food and Its Adulterations that laid out the scope of the problem in exhaustive detail. He even took to the lecture circuit, giving public demonstrations of how to detect common food frauds using a microscope. Slowly but surely, Hassall's work began to have an impact. The public was becoming more aware of the dangers of adulterated food, and they were demanding action. The Times of London, the most influential newspaper of the day, threw its weight behind the cause, publishing a series of scathing editorials that lambasted the poisoners of the food supply. In 1872, Parliament passed a more comprehensive Food Adulteration Act, which required local authorities to appoint public analysts to test food samples for purity. The Act also introduced penalties for offenders, including fines and even imprisonment. The fight against food adulteration was far from over, but Hassall's tireless work had laid the foundation for a new era of food safety. His legacy can be seen in the stringent food labeling and purity laws that govern the modern food industry, ensuring that the food we eat is safe, wholesome, and exactly what it claims to be. But the Victorian era had one more food scandal up its sleeve, one that would shock the nation and claim the lives of innocent children. This is the story of the Bradford sweets poisoning, a tragedy that unfolded in the most unlikely of places, a humble candy shop in the north of England. In the fall of 1858, a peddler named William Hardacre arrived in the town of Bradford, Yorkshire, with a batch of peppermint lozenges to sell. Hardacre was a familiar figure in the town, known for his colourful arrays of sweets and candies that he sold from a tray around his neck. On this particular occasion, Hardacre's lozenges were a vibrant green colour, flecked with bits of white. They were a hit with the local children, who gobbled them up eagerly. But within hours, the first victims began to fall ill. The symptoms were agonising: violent vomiting, searing abdominal pain, and an awful metallic taste in the mouth. By evening, more than 200 people had been stricken, most of them children. 21 would ultimately die, writhing in agony as their internal organs failed. The culprit, it turned out, was arsenic. Hardacre had purchased his peppermint oil from a local druggist, who had inadvertently mixed up his bottles and sold the peddler oil laced with the deadly poison. The green colour of the lozenges had come from the arsenic itself, which had been mixed in at a concentration of 12%. The Bradford poisoning was a shocking reminder of the dangers lurking in everyday foods. Arsenic was commonly used as a green colourant in Victorian confectionery, along with other toxic substances like copper and lead. There were no laws regulating the use of these poisons, and unscrupulous candy makers often used them to cut costs and create eye-catching colours. The tragedy sparked a wave of public outrage and calls for reform. Newspapers across the country ran lurid accounts of the children's suffering, accompanied by editorials demanding stricter regulations on food additives. The Times of London thundered that the poisoned sweet scandal was a national disgrace and a monstrous evil. Parliament, still reeling from the swill milk and rotten meat scandals, was forced to act. In 1860, they passed the Adulteration of Food and Drink Act, which prohibited the use of poisonous substances in food and required candy makers to list their ingredients on the label. The act was a major step forward, but it was still far from perfect. Loopholes in the law allowed candy makers to continue using toxic colorants as long as they were not directly added to the food. Copper salts, for example, could still be used to color pickles and preserves as long as they were applied to the jar lids rather than the food itself. Lead chromate, a bright yellow pigment, remained a popular coloring agent in custard powders and sauces. It would take another 2 decades and several more high-profile poisoning cases before Parliament finally passed the Sale of Food and Drugs Act of 1875, which closed many of these loopholes and established a system of food inspections and testing. The Act marked a major turning point in the fight for food safety, and its basic framework remains in place to this day. But the road to reform was long and bitter, paved with the suffering of ordinary people. The Victorian poor, in particular, bore the brunt of the era's food scandals. They were the ones who drank the swill milk, ate the rotten sausages, and sucked on the poison lozenges. They were the ones who suffered and died in the name of profit and greed. It is a testament to their resilience and determination that they kept on going, day after day, in the face of such unimaginable hardship. They fought for their rights, protested in the streets, and demanded change from their leaders. They may have been poor, but they were not powerless. As we look back on the food scandals of the Victorian era, it is easy to feel a sense of smugness or superiority. We live in an age of refrigeration, pasteurization, and strict food safety laws. We take for granted the abundance and variety of our modern diets, the ease with which we can access safe, nutritious food. But we should not be too quick to pat ourselves on the back. The fight for food justice is far from over. Even today, millions of people around the world go hungry or suffer from malnutrition. Food deserts, where fresh produce is scarce and fast food is abundant, are a reality in many low-income communities. The spectre of food adulteration, too, has not disappeared entirely, as the recurring scandals over tainted milk and fake honey remind us. The lessons of the Victorian era are as relevant today as they were 150 years ago. We must remain vigilant in the fight for safe, wholesome food. We must hold our leaders and corporations accountable for the food they produce and sell. And we must never forget the everyday courage and resilience of ordinary people, who have always been at the forefront of the struggle for food justice. As we come to the end of our journey through the dark and twisted world of Victorian food, it is worth reflecting on how far we have come. The hungry 40s and the filthy 50s may be distant memories, but their legacy lives on in the laws and regulations that govern our modern food system. We owe a debt of gratitude to the brave men and women who fought for food reform in the face of overwhelming odds. People like Henry Mayhew, who exposed the horrors of the swill milk trade, Arthur Hassel, who waged a one-man war against food adulteration, and the countless ordinary citizens who raised their voices in protest and demanded change. Their courage and determination laid the foundation for the food safety laws and regulations we take for granted today. Thanks to their efforts, we can walk into a supermarket and buy a carton of milk or a package of sausages without fear of being poisoned or sickened. We can sit down to a meal with our families and know that the food on our plates is safe and wholesome. But as we savor the bounty of our modern diets, let us also remember the hard-won victories of the past. Let us honor the memory of those who suffered and died in the fight for food justice, and let us recommit ourselves to carrying on their legacy. For the struggle for safe, nutritious food is never truly over. It is a constant battle against greed, ignorance, and indifference, a battle that requires eternal vigilance and tireless advocacy. As long as there are people who go hungry or suffer from foodborne illness, as long as there are corporations that put profit over public health, there will be work to be done. So let us take inspiration from the heroes of the Victorian era, and let us continue their fight for a world where everyone has access to safe, wholesome food. Let us build a future where no child goes to bed hungry, where no family has to choose between paying rent and buying groceries, and where the bounty of the earth is shared fairly and equitably among all people. It is a vision worth fighting for, a vision that the Victorian reformers would surely have embraced. And it is a vision that we, in our own time and in our own way, must work tirelessly to achieve. The story of food in Victorian London is not a pretty one. It is a tale of squalor and suffering, of greed and indifference, of a society that failed its most vulnerable members. But it is also a tale of courage and resilience, of ordinary people who refused to accept the unacceptable and who fought tirelessly for change. As we close this chapter of history and return to the comforts of our modern lives, let us carry their spirit with us. Let us remember that the fight for food justice is never truly won, but must be renewed with each generation. And let us honor the memory of those who came before us by continuing their work and building a world where all people can thrive. As we've seen, the fight for safe food was an uphill battle in Victorian London, with progress coming in fits and starts. But amid all the tales of tainted fare and toxic candy, there were glimmers of hope on the horizon. You see, by the late 1800s, the tide was slowly starting to turn. Scientific advances were shedding new light on the dangers lurking in the food supply, and a small but determined group of activists and officials were beginning to push for change. One such pioneer was Arthur Hill Hassall, a mild-mannered chemist with a mighty mission. Hassall had made it his life's work to uncover the truth about food adulteration. Armed with little more than a microscope and an unshakable sense of duty, he spent countless hours meticulously testing samples of tea, coffee, and other staples. And what he found was nothing short of shocking. In one famous case, Hassall discovered that a popular brand of coffee was generously enriched with a mixture of chicory, roasted wheat, and burnt sugar. Another so-called coffee contained not a single coffee bean, just a dubious blend of mustard seed, rice flour, and dog biscuit. Hassall's findings caused a sensation when they were published in the medical journal, The Lancet, in 1851. Suddenly, the ugly truth about food fraud was out there for all to see. But Hassall wasn't content to just expose the problem. He wanted to solve it. In 1860, largely thanks to Hassall's tireless advocacy, Parliament finally passed the first Food Adulteration Act. It was a watershed moment, the first time that food safety was enshrined in law. The Act prohibited the sale of adulterated food and drink, and empowered local authorities to enforce the new rules through inspection and testing. Of course, the road ahead was still long and bumpy. Unscrupulous merchants found ways to skirt the law, and enforcement was often lax. But the Food Adulteration Act was a crucial first step, a foundation to build on in the years to come, and build they did. In 1875, Parliament passed an even more comprehensive Food and Drugs Act, which tightened regulations and stiffened penalties for offenders. Suddenly, selling contaminated milk or poison-laced candy wasn't just immoral, it was illegal. This ushered in a new era of food safety, with local public analysts regularly sampling and testing products to keep consumers safe. Bit by bit, the food supply began to improve. Chalk and alum disappeared from the bread. Dairies were forced to clean up their act. And while food adulteration didn't vanish overnight, it was no longer the rampant scourge it had once been. But perhaps the most fascinating chapter in this story of food reform was the tale of the so-called Poison Squad. This was a group of uncommonly brave volunteers who, believe it or not, willingly ate foods laced with chemical additives to prove they were harmful. The Poison Squad was the brainchild of Dr. Harvey Wiley, the chief chemist at the US Department of Agriculture. Starting in 1902, Wiley recruited a group of young men to be his human guinea pigs. For 5 years, these stalwart volunteers dutifully downed doses of borax, formaldehyde, and other suspect substances that were commonly used as food preservatives at the time. The results were clear and damning. The Poison Squad suffered a litany of ailments, from digestive distress to headaches to depression. Some even had to drop out of the study due to the severity of their symptoms. But their sacrifice was not in vain. Wiley's findings caused a public outcry and added momentum to the growing push for stronger food safety laws. In 1906, Congress finally passed the landmark Pure Food and Drug Act, which prohibited the sale of misbranded or adulterated foods and laid the foundation for the modern FDA. So, As we reflect on the Victorian era from the comfort of our modern, well-regulated food system, it's worth remembering the everyday heroes who got us here. The chemists and campaigners, the whistleblowers, and the poison squad. These were the folks who quite literally put their money and their health where their mouths were. It's thanks to their courage and determination that we can now take for granted the luxury of not having to worry about chalk in our bread or lead in our candy. And while the Victorian poor may have had to endure the injustice of the hungry years, their sacrifices paved the way for a safer, healthier future for us all. As we wrap up our journey through the treacherous terrain of Victorian food, one thing is abundantly clear. We've come a long, long way. No longer do we have to play Russian roulette every time we sit down for a meal. No more do we have to worry that our sausage might contain something unspeakable, or that our milk might be more swill than goodness. But let's not get too complacent. The battle for safe, wholesome food is never truly over. Even today, with all our advances and regulations, food scandals still crop up from time to time. Tainted meat, contaminated produce, mislabeled ingredients. These modern menaces remind us that eternal vigilance is the price of a safe supper. So perhaps the real lesson of our Victorian food foray is simply this: to appreciate what we have, but never take it for granted. To remember the hard-won victories of the past, but also to stay watchful for the challenges of the future. And above all, to raise a glass of clean, unadulterated milk to the unsung heroes who fought so that we might eat without fear. The scientists and activists, the testers and tasters, these guardians of the gullet deserve a place of honor in our hearts and our histories. So the next time you bite into a sausage or sip a cup of tea, spare a thought for the folks who made it possible. The Victorians may have had to swallow some unsavory stuff, but in the end, their bitter fare paved the way for our sweet freedom. And on that palatable note, dear listener, it's time to rest your weary head. May your dreams be filled with glorious grub, untainted by the ghastly ghouls of yesteryear, for in the end, that's what our heroes were fighting for: the simple, sacred right to eat in peace. Good night and bon appétit. As the fight for food reform gained momentum, a group of unlikely heroes emerged, the so-called poison squad. These brave volunteers, led by the determined chemist Dr. Harvey Wiley, took it upon themselves to be human guinea pigs in the name of science and public health. You see, in the late 19th century, there were still no regulations on what additives could be used in food. Manufacturers could put virtually anything they wanted into their products, from formaldehyde to boric acid to copper sulfate. Dr. Wiley was convinced these chemicals were slowly poisoning the public, but he needed hard evidence to prove it. So in 1902, he assembled a group of young, healthy men and set them up in a special kitchen at the Department of Agriculture. There, they would eat meals laced with measured doses of suspected toxins, carefully noting any ill effects. The newspapers caught wind of the experiment and dubbed the volunteers the Poison Squad, a moniker they cheerfully embraced. For 5 years, these courageous men showed up each day to dine on borax-spiked butter, formaldehyde-laced meats, and sulfuric acid-treated molasses. They suffered through stomach pains, nausea, dizziness, and more in the name of science. When one squad member's hair began falling out and another's heart gave out, Dr. Wiley became alarmed and put an end to the borax experiment. But the Poison Squad had made their point. Their sacrifice provided the scientific proof needed to pass the landmark Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. This law finally banned toxic additives and laid the foundation for our modern food safety regulations. It was a hard-won victory that changed the American food supply for the better. Across the pond in Britain, similar reforms were underway. Public outcry over the swill milk scandal and the rampant adulteration of staples like bread and tea had reached a fever pitch. In 1875, Parliament passed the Sale of Food and Drugs Act, which made it illegal to sell adulterated products and establish standards for food purity. Local councils hired public analysts to routinely test food samples and root out fraudulent suppliers. Offenders faced fines and even jail time if caught hawking tainted goods. Gradually, the food supply began to improve as producers were held to higher standards of safety and quality. But change didn't happen overnight. Unscrupulous manufacturers still found ways to cheat the system, and enforcement of the new laws was often lax. It would take decades of tireless work by reformers and regulators to truly clean up Britain's food supply. Yet by the dawn of the 20th century, the tide was turning. The days of chalk-dusted bread, lead-laced candy, and strychnine-spiked beer were finally coming to an end. A safer, more wholesome food supply was on the horizon, thanks to the efforts of campaigners, scientists, and everyday citizens who refused to stay silent in the face of injustice. As we reflect back on the hungry years of Victorian Britain, it's easy to feel a sense of smug superiority. We modern folk, with our refrigerators and our food safety laws and our understanding of germs, could never fall prey to such horrors, right? But the truth is, the Victorians were not so different from us. They were simply people trying to feed their families the best way they knew how, in a world that was often stacked against them. In many ways, the story of food reform in Victorian Britain is a story of everyday courage. It's about the bravery of mothers who marched in the streets to demand pure milk for their babies, and the determination of scientists who spent long hours hunched over microscopes searching for the truth. It's about the resilience of a people who looked squalor and disease in the face and said, "No more." So the next time you bite into a sandwich or sip a cup of tea, take a moment to remember the unsung heroes who made it possible. The activists and reformers, the poison squad and the public analysts who fought so that we might eat without fear. They may not have statues erected in their honor or streets named after them, but their legacy lives on in every wholesome meal we enjoy today. And as we drift off to sleep, our bellies full and our minds at ease, let us offer a word of thanks for the invisible army that stands watch over our food supply. The inspectors and regulators, the farmers and producers who work tirelessly to ensure that the food on our plates is safe and nourishing. They are the inheritors of the Victorian reformers' legacy, the guardians of our modern bounty. In the end, perhaps that is the true lesson of the hungry years, that progress is possible even in the face of overwhelming odds. That by banding together and refusing to accept the status quo, ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things. It's a lesson that feels just as relevant today as it did over a century ago. So let us take heart from the example of our Victorian forebears. Let us celebrate their triumphs and learn from their struggles. And let us never forget the hard-won battles that brought us to where we are today. A world where food is not just sustenance, but a source of joy, community, and abundance. A world where the horrors of the hungry years are but a distant memory, fading like a half-remembered dream in the light of a new dawn. As the swill milk scandal raged on, another dietary staple was proving just as hazardous to the health of Victorian Londoners: meat. The city's explosive growth had created an insatiable demand for meat, and suppliers went to unscrupulous lengths to maximize their profits. Most of the meat arrived in the city already in a putrid state, having traveled for days without refrigeration. Butchers would mask the rotting flesh by dusting it with sulfites and dyeing it with red pigment to give it the appearance of freshness. This deception allowed them to pass off spoiled meat as a quality product to unsuspecting customers. But perhaps no one exemplified the unethical meat trade quite like Thomas Otter, the self-proclaimed sausage king. Otter built his sausage empire on the most unsavory of ingredients. His sausages were filled with sawdust, rotten meat, and even the flesh of dogs and horses. For years, Otter grew rich off of his adulterated sausages, while his customers suffered the consequences of consuming his tainted products. Otter's story is a cautionary tale of the dangers of unchecked greed and the importance of food regulation. He operated in a time when there were few laws in place to protect consumers from unscrupulous food producers. His cheap, adulterated sausages were a staple for many poor and working-class Londoners who could not afford better quality meat. They had no choice but to trust that the food they were buying was safe to eat. It wasn't until the 1860s that the tide began to turn against Otter and his ilk. A series of exposés in the press revealed the shocking truth about the state of London's meat supply. The public was outraged to learn that they had been unknowingly consuming rotten and adulterated meat. The government was finally forced to take action and passed the Adulteration of Food and Drink Act in 1860. The act prohibited the sale of food and drink that had been adulterated with harmful substances. While the act was a step in the right direction, it was not enough to completely stamp out the practice of food adulteration. Unscrupulous producers like Otter found ways to skirt the law and continue their deceptive practices. It would take several more decades and the tireless efforts of food safety advocates before real change was achieved. As we sip our tea and nibble on our biscuits, it's easy to forget the dark history behind these seemingly innocuous pleasures. But the tea adulteration scandal that rocked Victorian London serves as a stark reminder of the importance of food safety regulations. In the 19th century, tea was the beloved national drink of England, with even the poorest families indulging in a daily cup. But as demand for tea soared, so did the opportunity for unscrupulous merchants to make a quick profit. They began adulterating tea leaves with a host of unsavory ingredients, from sheep dung to toxic dyes. One of the most common adulterants was the leaves of other plants, such as hawthorn and sloe. These leaves were dried and mixed in with the tea, making it difficult for consumers to detect the deception. Some merchants even went so far as to use the spent leaves from other customers' teapots, drying them out and reselling them as fresh tea. But the adulteration didn't stop there. To make the tea look more appealing, merchants would often add poisonous green dyes made from copper. They also used black lead to make the tea appear darker and more robust. These toxic additives slowly poisoned the unsuspecting public. It wasn't until the work of one man that the full extent of the tea adulteration scandal came to light. Arthur Hill Hassell, a chemist and microscope expert, took it upon himself to investigate the purity of England's tea supply. He collected samples of tea from across London and analysed them under his microscope. What he found was shocking. Out of the dozens of samples he tested, not a single one was pure tea. They were all adulterated with other leaves, dyes, and even iron filings. Hassell published his findings in a series of articles for the Lancet Medical Journal, causing a public outcry. Thanks to Hassall's tireless work, the government was finally forced to take action. In 1875, they passed the Sale of Food and Drugs Act, which prohibited the adulteration of food and drink with any ingredients that could be harmful to human health. It was a major victory for food safety advocates and a turning point in the fight against food adulteration. But the battle was far from over. In a cruel twist of fate, the very substance that brought joy to so many children, candy, was also a source of hidden dangers. As sugar became more affordable in the mid-19th century, candy production exploded. Factories churned out cheap sweets by the ton, using whatever ingredients they could get their hands on to keep costs down. One of the most popular candies of the time was Jelly Babies, chewy sugar-coated treats in the shape of small infants. But the colourful coating that made them so appealing to children was often made with toxic pigments like red lead, copper, and mercury. The use of these poisonous substances in candy was shockingly widespread. In 1858, a tragic incident known as the Bradford sweets poisoning brought the issue to national attention. A candy seller in the town of Bradford used a batch of peppermint lozenges, that had been accidentally mixed with arsenic. 21 people died as a result, most of them children. The Bradford incident was a wake-up call for the British public, revealing the deadly consequences of unchecked food adulteration. But it was far from an isolated case. Similar poisonings occurred throughout the country as unscrupulous candy makers continued to use cheap, toxic ingredients. It wasn't until the passage of the Adulteration of Food and Drink Act in 1860 that things began to change. The act prohibited the use of any ingredient in food or drink that could be harmful to human health. Candy makers were now required to use only safe, approved colorings in their products. But the fight for food safety was far from over. It would take the tireless efforts of activists, scientists, and government regulators to truly transform the food industry. One of the most remarkable stories of this era was that of the so-called Poison Squad, a group of volunteers who put their own health on the line to prove the dangers of chemical additives in food. In 1902, Dr. Harvey Wiley, the chief chemist of the US Department of Agriculture, assembled a group of young men to participate in a groundbreaking experiment. For 5 years, the men ate a steady diet of foods laced with common chemical additives like borax, formaldehyde, and copper sulfate. Wiley carefully monitored their health, documenting the ill effects of these substances on the body. The results were clear. The chemicals were slowly poisoning the men, causing symptoms like headaches, nausea, and digestive distress. Wiley's work provided the scientific evidence needed to push for stronger food safety regulations. In 1906, the US Congress passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, which prohibited the use of harmful additives in food and required labeling of ingredients. Wiley's story is just one example of the everyday heroes who fought to make our food supply safer. From Arthur Hassel exposing the tea adulteration scandal to the brave volunteers of the Poison Squad, these individuals risked their own well-being to protect the public good. As we come to the end of our journey through the dark underbelly of Victorian London's food industry, it's easy to feel a sense of relief that those days are behind us. We can walk into a supermarket today and trust that the food on the shelves is safe and wholesome, thanks to the hard-won battles of the past. But the story of food adulteration is not just a relic of history. Even today, food fraud and contamination continue to be major issues worldwide. Horse meat is passed off as beef, olive oil is diluted with cheaper vegetable oils, and spices are cut with fillers like ground-up nutshells. The fight for pure, unadulterated food is an ongoing one. So the next time you sit down to a meal, take a moment to appreciate the food on your plate. Think about the long and sometimes sordid history behind each ingredient and the countless individuals who fought to ensure its safety and purity. From the chemists and activists to the regulators and whistleblowers, these unsung heroes have shaped the way we eat today. In the end, the story of Victorian London's food scandals is not just a tale of villains and victims. It's a story of progress, of the slow but steady march towards a safer and more transparent food system. It's a reminder that change is possible, even in the face of powerful interests and entrenched corruption. So let us remember the lessons of the past as we work to build a better future. Let us honor the courage and determination of those who came before us, and let us continue their legacy of fighting for safe, wholesome food for all. The road ahead may be long, but with vigilance and persistence, we can ensure that the food on our plates is a source of nourishment and joy, not fear and illness. The hungry years may be behind us, but the fight for pure food is far from over. As the tea adulteration scandal raged on, another dangerous threat to public health was emerging from an unexpected source: candy. In the early Victorian era, sugar was still a luxury item, but as the 19th century progressed, sugar became more affordable and plentiful. This fueled a boom in cheap candy production, with sweet shops popping up all over London to satisfy the British sweet tooth. But as with so many other foods of the time, the brightly coloured confections lining these shop windows hid a dark secret. You see, many candy makers were using toxic substances to colour their wares and maximise profits. Peppermint lozenges were infused with white lead to give them a pearly sheen. Gumdrops were coated in red lead or toxic vermilion. Copper was used to create a brilliant green, and mercury, of all things, was employed for a vibrant blue hue. It's almost unthinkable to us today, but at the time, there were virtually no regulations preventing confectioners from poisoning their own customers. One of the most tragic incidents to come out of this tainted candy trade was the Bradford sweets poisoning of 1858. That year, a street vendor by the name of William Hardacre purchased a large stock of peppermint lozenges from a respected wholesale confectioner. Unbeknownst to Hardacre, the sweets had been made with a lethal dose of arsenic, likely due to a mistake at the factory. Hardacre went on to sell these poisoned sweets to dozens of unsuspecting children around Bradford. The results were catastrophic. Within days, 21 people had died after consuming the arsenic-laced lozenges, with over 200 more falling severely ill. The victims were mostly children between the ages of 5 and 12, many of whom succumbed to violent vomiting and convulsions before finally perishing. The tragedy sent shockwaves through Victorian society and led to a public outcry over the unregulated candy trade. But even in the face of such senseless loss, change was slow to come. It would be years before Parliament passed any meaningful legislation to curb food adulteration. In the meantime, the poison candy makers, as the press took to calling them, continued to peddle their deadly confections to the children of London. It must have been a terrifying time to be a parent, never knowing if a single sweet could spell the end for your child. As we lie here in the comfort of our modern world, it's hard to imagine living under such constant threat of contamination and poisoning. The idea of candy being lethal, of all things, seems like something out of a nightmare or twisted fairy tale. But for the Victorians, it was just another cruel reality of the era's abysmal food standards. The poison candy makers may have profited from death for a time, but their legacy is one of tragedy. A bitter reminder of the human cost of unchecked greed and adulteration. But amidst all the darkness and suffering, there were glimmers of hope on the horizon. The fight for food reform was gaining momentum, thanks to the tireless efforts of scientists, activists, and even ordinary citizens who were no longer content to stay silent. One of the most remarkable stories to come out of this movement was that of the Poison Squad, a group of volunteers who willingly subjected themselves to poisoning in the name of consumer protection. The Poison Squad was the brainchild of Dr. Harvey Wiley, a chemist with the US Department of Agriculture. Wiley had long been concerned about the lack of regulation in the food industry and the widespread use of chemical additives. But he knew that to convince lawmakers to take action, he would need hard scientific evidence of the harm these substances could cause. So, in 1902, Wiley assembled a group of young, healthy men and set out to systematically poison them. The volunteers were fed a steady diet of foods laced with some of the most common chemical preservatives and additives of the time, including formaldehyde, sulfites, and borax. Wiley and his team meticulously documented the effects on the men's health, from mild symptoms like headaches and indigestion to more serious conditions like kidney damage and depression. The experiment went on for 5 years, with the Poison Squad members putting their own well-being on the line for the greater good. Their sacrifice paid off in 1906, when Wiley's findings helped push through the Pure Food and Drug Act, one of the first major pieces of consumer protection legislation in the United States. The act prohibited the sale of adulterated or misbranded foods and laid the groundwork for the modern FDA. Across the pond in England, a similar fight was being waged by the likes of Arthur Hassel and other champions of food safety. In 1875, Parliament finally passed the Sale of Food and Drugs Act, which made it illegal to sell adulterated food or drink. The Act also established a system of public analysts to test food samples and enforce standards. These hard-won reforms marked a turning point in the battle for pure food. Slowly but surely, the worst offences of the Victorian food trade began to be stamped out. Dairies could no longer get away with selling swill milk. Bakers were required to use wholesome ingredients, and the poison candy makers found their toxic recipes outlawed at last. By the dawn of the 20th century, the food supply in London and other major cities was cleaner and safer than it had been in generations. But the fight was far from over. As we'll see time and again throughout history, wherever there is money to be made, there will always be those willing to cut corners and put profit over people. Eternal vigilance, as they say, is the price of a safe supper. And so we come to the end of our journey through the dark and twisted annals of Victorian food. As the gas lamps flicker out along the narrow streets of London, we leave behind a world that is at once shockingly alien and hauntingly familiar. An era when bread could be made of chalk, beer spiked with strychnine, and candy coloured with poison. When slaughterhouses and dairies bred pestilence in the heart of the city, and the very water you drank could kill you where you stood. But we also leave behind a world of unsung heroes, men and women of science and conscience who fought against the tides of ignorance and greed to drag their society, kicking and screaming, into a safer, cleaner future. The likes of Henry Mayhew, John Snow, Arthur Hassel, and Harvey Wiley may not be household names, but we owe them a profound debt of gratitude. Through their dedication and sacrifice, they laid the foundations of modern food safety and saved untold millions from the slow, quiet ravages of adulteration. And what of the ordinary Victorians, the nameless masses who lived and struggled through this hungry 40s and beyond? Theirs was a world where every morsel was fraught with danger, where a single ill-chosen meal could spell the difference between life and death. And yet, in the face of such constant peril, they persevered. With no modern medicine to save them, no regulations to protect them, they endured the unendurable and clawed their way towards a brighter tomorrow. So tonight, as we drift off to sleep with visions of rotten meat and poison lozenges dancing in our heads, let us spare a thought for the unsung courage of the Victorians. They were a people forged in the crucible of adversity, a generation whose every waking moment was a fight for survival. And in that fight, they found a strength and resilience that echoes down through the ages, a reminder of the indomitable spirit of the human soul. And perhaps, in our own small way, we can draw inspiration from their example. For though the challenges we face today are different, the qualities that saw the Victorians through their darkest hours, compassion, determination, a thirst for justice, are as vital now as they ever were. May we strive to embody those virtues in our own lives, and in so doing, honour the memory of all those who came before. But for now, the hour grows late, and the mists of history beckon us to slumber. So let us bid goodnight to the ghosts of Victorian London, secure in the knowledge that their struggles were not in vain. And as we slip into the waiting arms of Morpheus, let us dream of a world where the food on every plate is safe, wholesome, and true. A world that our forebears could only imagine, but that we, with vigilance and care, may yet bring to pass. Good night, dear listener, and sweet dreams. May the spectre of the poison candy maker never darken your doorstep, and may your every meal be a blessing, untainted by the sins of the past. For in the light of a new day, we will rise to fight the good fight anew, armed with the hard-won wisdom of the ages. Until then, we rest and we remember. Good night. As the fight for food reform gained momentum, a group of unlikely heroes emerged, the so-called Poison Squad. These brave volunteers, led by the determined chemist Dr. Harvey Wiley, took it upon themselves to become human guinea pigs in the name of science and public safety. Dr. Wiley was a crusader against the unregulated food additives that had become so rampant in the Victorian era. He had seen firsthand the devastating effects of these substances on public health, from the swill milk scandal to the tragic Bradford sweets poisoning. But to prove his case and push for change, he needed hard evidence that these chemicals were truly harmful when consumed regularly. And so, in a bold and rather stomach-churning experiment, Dr. Wiley assembled a group of young, healthy men to test the effects of common food additives on the human body. For 5 years, these valiant volunteers dutifully reported to the basement of the Agriculture Department for their daily dose of borax, sulfuric acid, formaldehyde, or other noxious substances stirred into their food. As unappetizing as their meals sounded, the poison squad weren't allowed to grimace or grumble. They had to clean their plates and maintain a stiff upper lip, no matter how much their stomachs protested. Dr. Wiley kept meticulous records of their weight, digestion, and overall health throughout the experiment. The results were undeniable and quite alarming. The additives caused a host of unpleasant symptoms in the squad members, from headaches and nausea to more serious digestive issues. Some of the men lost weight and experienced alarming blood pressure changes. The evidence was clear. These chemicals had no place in the food supply. Armed with this groundbreaking data, Dr. Wiley became a powerful advocate for food safety reform. His findings shocked the public and shamed many manufacturers into cleaning up their act. The Poison Squad had literally put their bodies on the line to bring about change, and their sacrifice was not in vain. In 1875, Parliament finally passed the landmark Food and Drugs Act, which cracked down on food adulteration for the first time. Suddenly, there were actual consequences for palming off tainted or counterfeit products on an unsuspecting public. Manufacturers could no longer get away with diluting their wares with fillers or dousing them with toxic dyes. Of course, the fight was far from over. Shady producers still tried to skirt the law, but now inspectors were empowered to collect samples and levy fines, and even jail time on the worst offenders. Food safety became a matter of public trust, not just buyer beware. Gradually, the gruesome parade of Victorian food scandals began to taper off. Bread was less likely to be whitened with chalk and alum, milk was less commonly laced with plaster of Paris, and beer no longer carried the risk of strychnine poisoning. Food, slowly but surely, was becoming less of a gamble. None of this progress would have been possible without the determination of campaigners like Henry Mayhew, Arthur Hassall, and the brave Poison Squad, who fought to pull back the curtain on the unsavory food industry secrets. Their work saved untold lives and stomachs, and laid the groundwork for the modern food regulations we take for granted today. As the Victorian era drew to a close, Londoners could look back on decades of shocking food scandals and public health crises with a mix of horror and relief. The Hungry Years had been a time of squalor, disease, and no shortage of alimentary angst. But they had also showcased the everyday courage and resilience of a generation who refused to swallow the status quo. In reading about the appalling food conditions of the past, it's easy to feel a twinge of smug gratitude for our refrigerators and health inspectors and plastic-wrapped portions. But perhaps we owe the Victorians more credit than that. After all, they were the ones who finally said enough and began the long, slow work of making food safe for everyone. Their hard-won victories may seem quaint or old-fashioned to us now. A law against alum in bread, a fine for watering down milk. But those early food reformers were radicals in their time, daring to envision a world where food was more than just fuel, where a simple meal didn't have to be a dance with death. So the next time you sleepily shuffle to the fridge for a midnight snack, take a moment to savor not just the food, but the freedom of it. The luxury of not having to worry about being poisoned or swindled with every bite. And spare a thought for the unsung heroes of the Victorian era who fought to make that possible, so that you could one day eat in peace. Sweet dreams, dear listener, and bon appetit. As the sun set on another day in Victorian London, the city's inhabitants retreated to their homes, hoping to find some small comfort after a long day of toil. For many, that comfort came in the form of a humble meal, a moment of respite from the hunger that gnawed at their stomachs. But little did they know, the very food they relied on to sustain them was slowly poisoning them from within. In the dimly lit kitchens of the poor, families gathered around meagre portions of bread and tea, unaware of the horrors that lurked within each bite and sip. The bread, once a symbol of nourishment and life, had become a source of deception and danger. Bakers, driven by greed and desperation, took to adulterating their flour with alum, chalk, and other unsavory substances, all in the name of stretching their profits just a little bit further. The result was a loaf that looked deceptively wholesome on the outside, but harbored a host of health hazards within. And then there was the tea, the beloved beverage that had become a staple of British life. But even this small comfort was not immune to the schemes of unscrupulous merchants. They mixed tea leaves with leaves from other plants, sheep dung, and toxic dyes, creating a brew that was as dangerous as it was flavorful. The poor, who could barely afford the luxury of tea to begin with, were unknowingly sipping on a concoction that could slowly erode their health. But perhaps no food scandal was as shocking as the swill milk trade. In the squalid city dairies, emaciated cows were kept in filthy, cramped stables, fed on nothing but the swill left over from distilleries. The resulting milk was thin, bluish, and teeming with bacteria, yet it was sold to unsuspecting families as a wholesome source of nutrition. Infants, whose delicate systems were particularly vulnerable, often fell victim to the tainted milk, their lives cut tragically short by the very substance meant to nourish them. One man who witnessed the horrors of the swill milk trade firsthand was Henry Mayhew, a journalist and social reformer. Appalled by what he saw, Mayhew took it upon himself to expose the truth behind the dairy industry's dark underbelly. In a series of damning newspaper articles, he painted a vivid picture of the suffering endured by both the cows and the humans who consumed their milk. His words sparked outrage among the public, and slowly but surely, the tide began to turn against the swill milk trade. But the fight for safer food was far from over. In the meat markets of London, rotting carcasses were doctored with sulfites and red dye to appear fresh, then sold to unsuspecting customers. Sausage makers, ever eager to cut corners, mixed sawdust, old meat, and even the flesh of dogs and horses into their products, creating a cheap but potentially lethal meal. One such sausage maker was Thomas Otter, who earned the dubious title of the Sausage King for his ruthless business practices. Otter made a fortune by selling tainted sausages to the poor, his pockets lined with the profits of their misery. But even as he grew rich, the people who consumed his products suffered, their bodies weakened by the very food they ate to survive. As the years passed, the toll of adulterated food on the health of Londoners became impossible to ignore. Children wasted away from malnutrition, their growth stunted by a diet lacking in essential nutrients. Adults succumbed to a host of illnesses, their bodies slowly poisoned by the chemicals and filth that pervaded their food. It was a silent epidemic, one that ravaged the city's poorest and most vulnerable citizens. But amidst the darkness, there were glimmers of hope. Men like Arthur Hill Hassall, a chemist who dedicated his life to exposing food adulteration, worked tirelessly to bring the truth to light. Hassall spent countless hours in his laboratory, testing samples of tea, bread, and other staples for signs of contamination. His findings, published in a series of reports, shocked the nation and galvanized support for reform. And then there was the tragic case of the Bradford sweets poisoning, where 21 people lost their lives after consuming candy colored with toxic dyes. The incident was a stark reminder of the dangers lurking in even the most innocuous of treats, and it fueled the growing clamor for change. Slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. The passage of the Food Adulteration Act in 1860 marked a key milestone in the fight for safer food, as did the formation of groups like the Poison Squad, a band of brave volunteers who willingly subjected themselves to tainted food in order to prove its dangers. By the end of the Victorian era, the worst of the food scandals had begun to subside, thanks in no small part to the tireless efforts of reformers and activists. But the scars left by those dark years lingered on, etched into the collective memory of a city that had endured so much. As we look back on that time now from the comfort of our modern world, it's easy to feel a sense of disbelief at the horrors endured by our ancestors. But we must also remember the incredible resilience and courage they displayed in the face of such overwhelming adversity. The Victorians who lived through the hungry years were a testament to the indomitable human spirit, and their legacy lives on in the food safety regulations and standards we enjoy today. So the next time you sit down to a meal, take a moment to savor not just the flavors on your tongue, but also the hard-won peace of mind that comes with knowing your food is safe to eat. And spare a thought for the brave souls who fought to make that possible, the unsung heroes of a bygone era whose struggles paved the way for the abundance we now enjoy. As the Victorian era faded into memory, the spectre of food adulteration began to recede, driven back by the tireless efforts of reformers and the slow march of progress. But the impact of those dark years lingered on, woven into the very fabric of British society. For the poor, who had borne the brunt of the food scandals, life remained a daily struggle against hunger and malnutrition. Even as the worst excesses of the adulteration trade were curtailed, the underlying poverty that had fueled it persisted, a stubborn reminder of the deep inequalities that plagued Victorian society. But there were also glimmers of hope, signs that the tide was slowly turning in favour of safer, more wholesome food. The rise of the cooperative movement, with its emphasis on quality and transparency, offered a glimpse of a better way forward, and the growing middle class, with its increasing demand for purer, more reliable products, helped to drive a gradual shift in the food industry towards higher standards and greater accountability. Of course, change did not come easily, nor did it come quickly. The entrenched interests that had profited from the adulteration trade fought tooth and nail to preserve their lucrative business model, using every trick in the book to thwart the efforts of reformers. But slowly, inch by hard-won inch, the tide began to turn. One of the most significant milestones in this long and difficult struggle was the passage of the Sale of Food and Drugs Act in 1875. The act, which prohibited the sale of adulterated or misbranded food and drink, was a major victory for the reform movement, and it helped to pave the way for a new era of food safety and consumer protection. But even as the legislative battles were being fought, a quieter revolution was taking place in the realm of science and technology. The rise of analytical chemistry, with its ability to detect even the most subtle forms of adulteration, gave reformers a powerful new weapon in their arsenal. And the development of new preservation methods, such as canning and refrigeration, helped to reduce the incentives for food fraud and ensure a more stable, reliable supply of wholesome food. As the Victorian era drew to a close, the worst of the food scandals had begun to fade into memory, replaced by a growing sense of optimism about the future of food. But the legacy of those dark years lived on, woven into the fabric of British culture and society in ways both subtle and profound. In the decades that followed, the fight for safer, more wholesome food would continue, taking on new forms and new challenges as the world around it changed. But through it all, the spirit of the Victorian reformers would endure, a testament to the power of human ingenuity and the unquenchable thirst for justice that lies at the heart of our species. And so, as we look back on that distant era now, from the vantage point of our own time, we can see in it both a cautionary tale and a source of inspiration. The struggles of the Victorians remind us of the dangers of unchecked greed and the importance of vigilance in the face of those who would put profit above public health. But they also speak to the incredible resilience and courage of the human spirit and the power of ordinary people to bring about extraordinary change. In the end, perhaps that is the true legacy of the Victorian era's food scandals. Not just the darkness and despair they inflicted, but also the light and hope they ultimately inspired. For in the face of even the most daunting challenges, the human spirit has a way of rising up, of finding new paths forward and new ways to build a better world. And so, as we drift off to sleep, our bellies full and our minds at ease, let us spare a thought for the brave souls who came before us, the men and women who fought so hard to make our modern abundance possible. Let us honor their memory by cherishing the gifts they gave us and by working in our own small ways to carry forward the torch of progress they so nobly bore. For in the end, the story of food is the story of us all, of the endless struggle to nourish and sustain ourselves in a world that is not always kind. And in that struggle, we are all united, bound together by the common threads of hunger and hope, fear and fortitude. So let us take comfort in that unity, in the knowledge that we are all part of a great and ongoing tapestry, woven from the countless small acts of courage and compassion that make up the human experience. And let us face the challenges of our own time with the same spirit of determination and resilience that carried the Victorians through their darkest hours. For in the end, that is the true legacy of history. Not just the tales of great deeds and grand achievements, but also the quiet, everyday heroism of ordinary people, doing their best to make the world a little bit better, one small act at a time. And so, as the last embers of the day fade into the gathering dusk, let us close our eyes and drift off to sleep, secure in the knowledge that we are part of something greater than ourselves, a grand and enduring story that stretches back through the ages and forward into the uncertain future. A story of struggle and triumph, of darkness and light, of the unending resilience of the human spirit in the face of even the most daunting odds. A story that, in the end, is the story of us all. As the 19th century drew to a close, the fight for safer food was far from over, but the tireless efforts of reformers like Arthur Hassall and the Poison Squad volunteers had begun to turn the tide. Their work shone a light on the dark underbelly of the Victorian food industry, exposing the unscrupulous practices that had gone unchecked for too long. The Food Adulteration Act of 1860 and the Food and Drugs Act of 1875 were important milestones, but changing entrenched ways would prove to be an uphill battle. Food manufacturers and merchants had grown accustomed to cutting corners and maximizing profits at the expense of public health. Weaning them off adulterants and deceptive practices would require constant vigilance. But brick by brick, the foundation for modern food safety standards was being laid. Local health inspectors, armed with new legal powers, began making regular checks on food sellers. Fines and even jail time awaited those caught peddling adulterated or unsanitary goods. Slowly but surely, the idea that food should be safe, wholesome, and exactly what it claimed to be started to take root. Of course, the road ahead was long. Well into the 20th century, scandals would continue to crop up, revealing that the food supply still had weak points. But each new revelation was met with public outcry and calls for stronger regulations. The Victorian reformers had set the wheels of change in motion, and there would be no turning back. As we look back on this tumultuous chapter in history, it's easy to recoil in horror at the thought of drinking swill milk or eating lead-laced candy. But we must also remember the incredible resilience of the Victorian people. They endured the hungry years with a stoicism and courage that is hard to fathom today. For the poor, adulterated food was often the only food they could afford. They knew it might make them sick, but the alternative was starvation. For the middle and upper classes, the risks were less stark, but no less real. Every bite of bread or sip of tea was a gamble. Would it nourish or poison? It was a question that lurked in the back of everyone's mind. Yet despite the daily threats to their health, the Victorians soldiered on. They went to work, raised families, and built an empire that stretched around the globe. They did not let the fear of tainted food paralyze them. Instead, they fought back in ways big and small. Some, like Henry Mayhew and Arthur Hassall, used the power of the press to expose wrongdoing and demand change. Others, like the brave Poison Squad, volunteered their own bodies to the cause of science. And still others, the nameless masses, simply refused to accept the status quo. They complained to shopkeepers, boycotted bad actors, and made their voices heard. It is this spirit of defiance in the face of adversity that we should remember most about the Victorians. Yes, their food was often adulterated and unsafe, but they did not let that define them. Instead, they fought for something better. A world where food could be trusted and where no one had to live in fear of their next meal. As we drift off to sleep tonight, let us spare a thought for those who came before us. The Victorians lived through some of the darkest days in the history of food, but they emerged on the other side with their heads held high. They left us a legacy of courage, determination, and an unwavering belief in the power of change. And so, my friends, as we close this chapter on the trials and triumphs of Victorian food, I leave you with a gentle reminder. The next time you sit down to a meal, take a moment to savor not just the flavors on your tongue, but the hard-won safety and abundance that we so often take for granted. It is a gift that was bought with the blood, sweat, and tears of those who came before us. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the annals of culinary history. I hope you found it as fascinating and eye-opening as I have. If you enjoyed this little foray into the past, I invite you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are always more stories to tell and more lessons to learn from the fascinating foibles of our ancestors. But for now, my weary traveler, it's time to rest. Let the gentle currents of history carry you off to a peaceful slumber. And may your dreams be filled not with the horrors of Victorian food, but with the hopes and aspirations of a people who refuse to be beaten by adversity. Good night and sweet dreams.